First off, thank you all for joining today, the WorkTango webinar series. We're excited to come back in 2020 with a whole new level of content and great speakers, and really just add value to our workplace and HR community. So this, this webinar topic you can see on the slide here is really about after the survey. Or how are you going to action your employee survey data? It's 96% of companies out there are doing something when it comes to listening to the voice of employees. But again, what can we learn from an acting perspective? A couple of just a few items before we get started. First thing, I did want to introduce kind of myself and our speakers today. So first things first, my name is Rob Catalano. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at a company called WorkTango that puts these webinar series on. I've spent the last 17 years, whether it's building HR technology companies or consulting organizations through things like engagement, recognition, actioning, etc. And really excited to kind of be here today. But it's not my show today. Our goal is to bring in really smart people to help give their insights as well. And I want to introduce Norm, and unfortunately David had a family item that's taking him away today. So originally David was going to be here. He sends his regrets. I know he's excited to see the webinar recording. So Norm, you're on your own today, but knowing you, it won't be an issue at all.
Yeah, I can handle it. Good afternoon, everybody.
So just before giving Norm the ball, a couple things about Norm. Norm's a partner at a company called Entegritē. He's basically an expert in employee engagement, organizational development, strategic planning, and literally over the last 30 years across Canada and the world has helped organizations improve performance, focus on leadership and on managers to really build a more engaging employee experience. One of the great parts of his bio that I'd love to read was he's well known for his capability to turn mountains of data into a cohesive, compelling, and insightful story which leads to action. And that's exactly what this topic is all about. Not to mention, last thing, Norm, you're a good guy. That's something I'll add to it. But I always find bios are pretty boring. It's kind of reading someone's history. Is there anything that I don't know about you, or that anyone here would not know about you normally, that wouldn't be sitting on a resume somewhere? Something interesting.
Well, yeah. For first thing I want to do is thank you guys for having us on, or having me on. I guess Dave's indisposed with a family emergency, as you said. I think really where I see this meshing very well is we both have a passion essentially for improving the work experience. I've been doing surveys, employee surveys, for 30 plus years. It's like taking the temperature without doing any treatment afterwards. Nothing happens unless we act. And so really that's my passion in this entire endeavor. And I can basically, you're going to keep doing this unless and until I'm having fun. And that's pretty much how I have fun, other than cooking up a storm when I get home on the weekends. So.
All right, awesome. I'm going to invite myself over from dinner one day when I'm
absolutely. You don't have. I'll invite you, so you don't have to invite yourself.
All right, sounds good. So it looks like we have some time where some more people join. So a couple of last things from a housekeeping perspective. There are two places in Zoom that we're hoping people will participate. The first is the chat function. And the chat function is really around, do you have any issues? Do you need some help? Is there any other question you have outside of questions for the speakers? So, if you click chat and go in there, Stephen, who's on our call here from WorkTango, will address those and make sure you have everything you need. But if you do want to address a speaker and you want to ask a question, and we really encourage that, use the Q&A button. I'll be monitoring those, and I have I was given permission by Norm to interrupt whenever I can and want to ask those questions, to dig a little deeper. So please, look forward to seeing some questions there. And always, every time people are telling you these things on a webinar, people their eyes gloss over, they don't pay attention. So one thing I thought would do is, don't ask a question, but in the chat button, can everyone just tell me one word about how you're feeling today? Just want to get you seeing where the chat button is, seeing where the QA panel is. Ecstatic. Tyler's ecstatic. Someone said cold. Yes, I'm in Toronto. Norm's in Ottawa. Cold. A lot of excited. Snowed in. Jazzed. Oh my gosh. Overwhelmed. Sleepy. Who's sleepy there? It's going so fast, I can't even tell. A lot of snowed in. A lot of Canadians, looks like. Caffeinated. I'm very jealous of Caitlin on the caffeinated side. Great. So a lot of excited, cold, and potentially sleepy people. So awesome. Now everyone knows exactly where to go to chat. And but again, if you have questions in that same panel, definitely ask them in the Q&A. And two people put their, oh, someone just deleted it. They put it in the Q&A, but yeah, leave that stuff in the chat. All right, well, that being said, let's get into the content. So first thing, before handing over to Norm, this is something I have on my desk every day because it's a real reminder of really, the passion I have and the business I'm in. To Norm's point, I spend day in and day out helping organizations hear the voice of employees to really, at the end of the day, act and change behaviors, right? It's not a compliance thing to get your survey out. It's not about just getting the data and the insights. It's really about acting and the behavior change in order to create a better employee experience or improve the data that's coming in. So, our topics are typically a little more broad, but we want to be very, very specific for this webinar to dig into something that a lot of organizations struggle with. A lot of organizations are looking to improve in their organization. So this is really something that I like to frame the conversation with. Now, what's interesting about this is before handing it over to Norm, one of the things I found has been happening a lot in companies I've worked with is they've actually been a lot more frequent in hearing the voice of employees. Like organizations are switching from maybe an annual survey to things that are a lot more frequent. I see organizations where every 2 weeks, a month, they're getting a quick pulse of their team. And the point I want to make here is that it gets even more challenging to act, right, when things are getting more frequent from a data perspective. So the lens I always like to put on this is if you're thinking of surveying your employees, there isn't really anything like survey fatigue. There's lack of action fatigue. Right? Companies have figured out ways to get that feedback and change behaviors and impact, from an action perspective, what's happening in organizations. So this is kind of the mindset I wanted to kind of set it off with and let Norm kind of dive into a lot of his experience, how companies are actually making that action bucket, checkbox into what they see successful in their company. So Norm, again, really appreciate being here, and I'll shoot it over to you.
Okay, thank you for having me again. And so let's, we'll hand it over to me, I guess. And there we go. Whoops. There's a little bit of delay here, so I apologize, folks, if I'm getting the slides a little bit mixed up. First of all, I want to say thank you. I see a lot of familiar names people I have worked with in the past at my various different lives over the years, so thanks for joining again. And those of you who know me from my previous webinars know I like to start with Dilbert, only because it's so real. And so as you're listening to me drone on here, take a look at the cartoon. But I also start with sort of giving a little briefer in terms of why we're talking about this. And why this subject is coming up, I think, Rob, you explained it pretty well. We see so many companies, so many organizations that are rushing to use the platforms, to get the surveys out, to collect the data, and after 3, 4, 6 months, 1 year, they peter out. And why are they petering out is because now they're engulfed in so much data that they just don't have time to act on it. And of course, what that does is every time you ask a question, an employee expects an answer. More precisely, they expect you to do something with the answer that they gave you. Otherwise, they don't think you're listening. And when they don't think you're listening, well, guess what happens? They don't answer the survey anymore. So that's really the gauge here. And the other thing here is in terms of how we're using the technology. Rob's going to come in after me and talk about some really, really cool things that the technology is allowing us to do with engagement. But at the same time, some organizations are losing sight of what engagement is all about to begin with that technology. So that's just a preface in terms of where we're going with this. The question that I get most often when I'm talking to someone who's just done a survey, and they're going to call me up or they're going to email me or text me, they're going to say, Norm, how do we go about the action planning? Do we do this top down or do we do it bottom up? And the answer to that question is really both and neither at the same time, because the question is a little bit misguided. Nonetheless, the way I'm going to approach this is a little bit talking to that question directly, because the approaches can be a little bit different. But essentially, the message here is everybody, executives, senior leadership, middle managers, right down to employees, need to contribute to the engagement conversation. And yes, they're going to have different roles, but what we're going to see here is how we pull that all together to make sure that the engagement conversation results in that all-important action. And there's a couple of key words in what I just said, and one of those key words is conversation. Whether or not the approach is considered quote-unquote top-down or bottom-up, both types of approaches rely heavily on conversation. So what I'm flashing here is, you'll see these slides after, so they're a bit wordy and texty. I do that on purpose, so after we go away and you've got the presentation itself and you've got a little bit of content to deal with, you can just listen to me now and I'll talk through the basic things here. So you just saw in the previous slide, yes, senior leadership has a key role to play in this, and they have key things that they need to do to engage employees. We already know that stuff. That's not new. I think one thing that a lot of managers tend to forget, because managers, we're ultimately problem solvers. And so when we get our engagement results, what do we want to do? We want to solve the issue. We want to make things better. We want to get into that transformation. We want to do the continuous improvement. And in doing so, we think we got the best ideas to do that. But what we have to understand is engagement is not like finance. It's not like operations. It's not like certain aspects of HR. Because engagement relies on the individual. Each individual owns their own engagement. So you can't improve employee engagement without the employee themselves. And so sitting in a boardroom, thinking up an action plan, which is a very quintessential top-down way of doing things, guess what? It's going to fall flat, because whether the employees don't feel that they're involved, but they do have a responsibility. And that's the other thing that we have to pay attention to, is it's not all management's issue. When we do a lot of focus groups, you get a lot of, venting and complaining. Management this, leadership that, management this, leadership that. They've got to fix it. Well, management and leadership can't do that by themselves, and employees have an important role to play, and we have to essentially remind them of that throughout that. So leadership, yes, creates the environment, but ultimately the employee needs to participate, and it's that employee participation and the fusion of leadership and employee through conversation that's going to result in an action plan and action that's effective. I'm talking a little bit high level now, and I apologize for that. So go ahead, Rob. You have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to interrupt, and a question didn't come in. I just had one, but I get, being in a similar space, I always get the pushback from executives that this is an HR thing. Like, HR is responsible for this. They have to fix it. They're the ones that need to kind of take it to the next level. And I'm wondering what advice you might have for people on the webinar on how could you combat that conversation? What could you say, or what stories would resonate? And just trying to get a sense of how you would approach that.
That's a great question. We were just talking before we went on about a specific client out west, where for years they held the mantle, and it's an HR shop with over 100 people. So this is a big organization, and year after year, the employee engagement question came down to the director's desk and said, "Okay, these are you guys. You own this. You fix this. That's what you have to do." The issue is HR, as this audience well knows, can set policy, you can deliver programs, and you can manage benefits and compensation and all of that good stuff, but what you're not able to do is act for the managers in the line. And that's where the engagement takes place. It takes place in the individual's own work environment. Employee engagement has to be an organization-wide, leadership-driven initiative and ongoing management style. If it's not, if HR is charged with doing this, there can only get so far, because the rest of the leadership won't follow along. It has to be organization-wide. And it has to be driven by the entire leadership of the team, of the organization. Otherwise, it is going to fall flat. HR can't own this by themselves, right? And so I can tell you one of the biggest differentiators between those organizations I deal with, which are very, very strongly engaged, have a very high level of engagement, and those that struggle, is those that struggle do the survey because they think it's the right thing to do. It's trendy, it's buzz. We got to do this. and then they sort of dissociate and they say, okay, HR, here's your results, go work with it. Those are the organizations that are going to struggle. The ones that are going to do really well is when the CEO and the C-suite as a team decide, you know what, we want more engaged individuals in our organization. We understand the benefits of that. We understand that more engagement is going to be good for the work experience, but it's also going to be good for the organization. And we're going to drive that throughout the organization. When that happens, the chances now improve exponentially that, you know what, we're going to have a higher engaged organization. So I hope, Rob, that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah.
I think as we go through the rest of the webinar content, we'll get a little bit more clarity. But
okay, great. Yeah, no, and I was just trying to kind of get the ball rolling.
Absolutely.
None of these questions are planned. I'm just trying to stump Norm, to be honest.
Yeah.
There actually just one comment I just saw pop up, and it wasn't really a question from Michael. Basically said, given that the executives are responsible for the performance of the organization, they must be responsible for employee engagement, not HR. And I just like that kind of play on, you're responsible for the success of the company, which includes, all that success and outcome that you're going to see as an organization. The inputs are the employee behaviors that occur every single day. So I like that comment.
Give you a very, very hard, sort of very concrete example. So I do a lot of work in municipalities, and I think you guys do as well. And in a municipality, you got your HR function, but you also got very, very different functions like finance. But the one I'm thinking about is public works. It's those guys that are out on the streets. They're, they're fixing the roads. They're doing all that kind of stuff. And you know what? Their interaction with somebody at HR might come, once a month, once every 6 months. They don't tend to interact on a daily basis with HR. They interact with the people that essentially charge them with their work, their boss, their colleagues, the public. And those are the folks that are going to have the influence on engagement. HR is going to have very little influence on engagement other than a policy email that they might be able to send, or a career program, or an employee assistance program for a very small minority of individuals. So that's a very good example of if the rest of the organization is not on the ball with this, it's going to fall flat.
Okay.
So with that being said, I'm going to address this as sort of the top-down, bottom-up question, even though that's not necessarily the right question. But it's the way organizations work. So the corporate-wide approach. When do we use the corporate-wide approach? The first, in most medium, large-size organizations, and rule of thumb, 500-plus employees, you're going to need some sort of overarching policy program in terms of doing some of the things that we need to do for engagement. So in smaller organizations, this is a lot easier to do. In large organizations, what we need to have is a much more cross-cutting approach. Also, what you should be looking at if you're looking at quote-unquote top-down or bottom-up are the drivers of engagement, those themes that really have been shown in your surveys to influence engagement, leadership, organizational vision, professional growth, or career growth. Are those consistent across the organization? And if they are, you don't want every manager in every department reinventing the wheel. You want corporate consistency. And of course, leadership and vision needs to happen at the top anyway. So these are areas where it makes the most sense to start this with a organization-wide approach. The other issue we see a lot is silos. And one of the side benefits of a highly engaged organization is we are able to break down silos. And if that's an objective here, then we need a consistent horizontal approach. We need managers to be singing from the same song sheet, to basically say, these are all of the issues, whether it's career growth, leadership, vision, immediate management, we're going to all work on these things together. And then where corporate-wide policies and programs are necessary. So if you're going to start, for example, if in response to an issue around career growth, you're going to start a corporate-wide program, well, obviously, this is where an organization-wide or corporate-wide approach is called for. Now, this is where it breaks apart, because when I say organization-wide, corporate-wide, top-down, whatever phrase we use, a lot of people say, oh, okay, well, you know what? That means the managers, and we're going to settle this at the C-suite and then in the boardroom. No. This is basically, it doesn't mean organization-wide or top-down doesn't mean the engagement action plan is decided by management. On the contrary, the most successful organization-wide top-down employee action plans, employee engagement action plans, and I've done these in very, very large organizations, are actually employee-led. How is that possible if you're going to have, you know, we got thousands of employees in a specific organization? Let's take a large one, for example. I'm thinking of a utility we worked with very recently, or I worked with very recently, out west. And that utility has the better part of 10,000 employees in it. And, you know, they're thinking of, okay, well, we want to do a large part of this organization. Why? But still, it has to be employee-led. How do you do that? Well, there's two ways. The first one is you need to set, and many organizations do this already, but you need to have an employee engagement. Now, call it a steering committee. I find that's very formal, but a working group, task force, call it what you will, but you need to draw a very, very select number of employees from all areas of the core of the organization, and I'll say how in a minute, to participate, to lead this charge. It's not led by the C-suite. And then the next part of this is that group is going to act as an advisory board or a board of directors for the engagement initiatives. But what really works is when we have one or a number of corporate or organization-wide, employee-led, but professionally facilitated action planning workshops. And I'll talk to you about a little bit about how some of those work. Some of you on the webinar have already been through a couple of these things with me, so you'll know what's coming essentially on that. So what does a successful engagement committee look like? First of all, it's not 50 people. It's very small, 8 to 12 participants. Why? Well, because what we're looking for is a team, a group dynamic that's going to be of optimal size. You need at least 8 people to get the dynamic, and probably in most organizations to get enough representation together. More than 12 and you're going to have people not dropping out literally, but dropping out figuratively. They won't participate as much in the discussion. They won't get as much airtime. They won't have their ideas heard, and you'll have the issue of dominant personalities. But with 12, you sort of give everybody a good chance to participate. They need to be drawn from everywhere in the organization. So what we call diagonal representation, managers, even senior leadership. Now let me talk about that in a second, but managers, and cut across departments and cut across levels. So, but the senior leaders, I often get the response, oh, well, we don't want to be part of that because we're going to influence, and they're not going to want to talk freely, and yada, yada, yada. And that's basically an excuse for, I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to own this. And I can see that coming. So, but I'll insist in both the action planning workshop and the steering committee or the task force itself, you need at least 1 or 2 senior leaders to participate in this. Not as the group leader, not as the chair, but as an equal participant. Why? Because when decisions get made in that group, if senior leadership is not present, what tends to happen is the employee group will come up with a wish list, or at least so perceived by the C-suite, and then it'll be a negotiation. Oh, we can't do this. Oh, we don't have the budget to do that. They won't feel that they own it. But if leaders are participating in those deliberations, then they act as advocates. And they're very vocal around the C-suite with their colleagues saying, listen, folks, you know what? These guys have a point here. We got to do this. And I've seen this dynamic in action. So it's really important to have 1 or 2 senior leaders as part of this. They have to have a clear mandate. They have to have a terms of reference. They got to know what they're going to be responsible for. And that should emerge directly from the survey results, right? What are the drivers of engagement? That's going to be our areas of focus. What are we going to come up with? An action plan. When are we going to come up with it? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And then, you know what? You keep 8 to 12 people in a large organization is not a lot. So we got to give them the time to participate in this, and that's not a heavy burden. It's probably at the beginning of a meeting every couple of weeks, after that a meeting a month, and rotate the people in and out. And you're going to see that as this takes off and as this group becomes more and more influential in terms of setting policy, establishing programs, and delivering on engagement initiatives, people are going to be putting their hands up because they're going to want to participate in it. It's fun.
Hey Norm, there was a really timely question there that said, how would it work for a global organization? So is there a committee per country, participants that, span across different countries? Like, what would be your recommendations for a much larger global company?
I've seen a couple of different ways of doing it. So you can have it tiered. So you have if it's a global organization, and a centralized global organization where you have a lot of decision-making policy program that has to take place at the top and that spans a number of different countries, then it makes sense to have a group at the top. Now, technology is wonderful for this because now we can Skype, now we can do virtual meetings. People don't have to fly all over the world to meet anymore. They can do this, and so the burden is a lot less, and we can still have a lot of the interaction. But the other things, and when I talk about the bottom-up side, you'll see this, is when, especially when we're talking about multiple countries, you're going to have cultural issues. You're going to have different things that engage in different countries or different departments. And that's where the bottom-up process works a little bit better, so you might want to break that down. So it's hard for me to prescribe one way. It really is a case-by-case scenario, and I've seen it work both ways. So where I was going at here, the action planning workshop. So essentially, people get a little scared by this. It looks kind of involved, and that's why we call for a professional facilitator, either internal or external. That really doesn't matter, but somebody who knows how to manage a group. And then it has to have a certain number of components to it. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, only to say the key success factors in any action planning workshop. Number one is it has to, just like the steering committee, it has to draw employees from all over the organization. We did some work. I did some work with an airport very recently, and that's really an eclectic bunch of people, because you got certain people who are out there painting the lines on the runways, and you got Harvard MBAs that are doing finance, and you got such a mix of different skill sets. And yet some of the best ideas in terms of how to engage individuals didn't require the Harvard MBA. It came from the guy who did the paint job, right? And that interaction is key. So really that participation throughout. Now the workshop size, ideally, anywhere, you need at least about 20, 25 people. I say up to 50. I've done as many as 125. It gets a little bit hairy when you get up more than 75 people. But what you're trying to do here is, number one, establish a fun atmosphere. What we're focused on here is the concept of focused ideation. We want people to generate ideas. To generate ideas, you gotta have fun. Excuse me. You gotta have fun. And to have fun, there's a number of exercises that we get. We get people to cut and paste and stick, but we do so not just sort of willy-nilly, always focused on the survey results and always focused on the emerging issues of those surveys. So I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a second. But those are the key things. And then it's really around, after you've generated all those ideas, then it's around having your participants look at them, evaluate them, criticize them, and figure out, okay, how are they actually going to work? So I'm not going to go through the agenda in detail. You'll have this later, but it will give you a recipe to actually know how to go about doing one of these workshops, facilitating one of the workshops, and we have all the tools are available to do that. One of the key ones here is to get people to come up with ideas is very difficult. If you've tried this, if you've done innovation before, and you put a problem before somebody, how do we improve career growth or professional growth in our organization? We put that to a group, and you get the blank stares and the open jaws. And why is that? And first of all is we're not sure of the problem. So you get a lot of discussion about restating what is the actual issue. And we know what the issue is. You've done the survey by now. You don't want to do that. And the other thing is, well, people are sort of afraid of putting their own issue on the table and stating the problem in those terms, especially when you've got mixed levels. So what we do here, and what I counsel you to do, is bring it down to very brass tacks. So what we do in our workshops is we create scenarios, and those scenarios emerge directly from your survey results. And the scenario should be an amalgam or sort of a combination. It shouldn't be one particular issue or problems faced by a single individual. When you read through all of the survey results, you get an idea of what some of the issues are. So you can concoct a fictitious scenario, as you see an example here on the slide. And when people read that, this is the stuff they talk about at the water cooler. Everybody's got ideas on how to fix Sam's problem. And so that's what comes out. And so we give them the tools, we give them sheets, we give them cards, they write it down, they post it on a wall, and you get, believe you me, anywhere from about 75 to as many as I've had 150 ideas come out of an hour and a half, so an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half spent on doing these things. And of course, they're all, we call it focused ideation, because all these ideas are focused on those drivers of engagement that emerge through the survey. So it's all evidence-based. And you can see here, this is some of the results. This is what it looks like. So the fun part, creating a fictitious employee upon which we project the issues of the organization. So we ask questions around, what does career growth mean to you? That type of thing, what are your issues around leadership? And we get them to project on these pictures, which are very, very visual and very creative. And then they start to post those ideas, and you can see a couple of examples of that. One of the things that I love to point out here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not. I often get a lot of pushback from organizations like police, fire, military, lawyers, professionals. Oh, this is never going to work with us. Like, these guys are way too serious, and you can't do that with us. Right? It's too much fun. No, you can see this gentleman here in the bottom right-hand corner is a fireman. He's a firefighter. We've done this with lawyers. We've done this with police. We've done this with military. Everybody likes to have fun, folks. As long as we create that environment for fun, people are going to participate and bring in their ideas. So fast forward, what comes out of this? What comes out of this is an actual action plan. That's what you're aiming for in this top-down approach, quote-unquote. Something very, very pithy, brief, succinct, 1 page, 2 page, not the bureaucratic 10-page action plan that they're going to submit to HR by the 30th of the month. That's just work, right? So, and people don't want an extra burden. And that's one of the reasons why engagement action planning peters out is because people are taking on more quote-unquote work. So what comes out of one of these workshops is a number of very, very key actions, enough to describe it, who owns it, and when's it going to happen. That's an action plan, folks, right? Then it's not more difficult than that. We don't want people to spend their time documenting and doing bureaucracy and administration so that they can submit something to HR that only has a 30% chance of actually getting acted upon. We want people to be enthusiastic, and they are when it's their ideas. Remember, this is employee-led. When it's their ideas, you better believe they volunteer. And there's only very few of them here. 6 ideas, that's it. 6 things out of that group of 75, you get 6 initiatives that emerge. They vote on it. There's techniques for doing that. And something that comes out is very, very succinct. What we were driving for is the ACT, act, change, right? That's what we want to do. So that happens at a corporate level. That happens at an organizational level. In large organizations like a global organization, you can have that at a multi-department, country level. That can take place at different levels. But what about the bottom-up? Where do we sort of decentralize now the bottom-up approach in terms of action plan? When do we use it? Well, in many organizations, those engagement drivers that are maybe consistent in some areas might be quite different, whether you're talking about one department or a second department, the finance department versus the public works department versus operations. If they have very largely different issues, trying to solve them in an organizational-wide approach is not going to be very helpful. And the other thing is, you know what, in many of your organizations, even though the drivers may be consistent, the perception might be, this happens in very siloed organizations, many siloed organizations, the perception might be that, you know what, we're different. We need to do our own thing here. Marketing needs to, we want to work on this, and fine, let them. Don't impose anything on them. If there are common issues, common themes, then you can use that corporate-wide approach. But this doesn't mean that we can't allow, nor should we inhibit a bottom-up approach. In actual fact, if I went back to one of those first slides, you saw the two meeting in the middle. And the actual question, bottom-up, top-down, the answer is both, really. Unless you're a very small organization where you don't need to be repetitive. So if you don't need a number of corporate-wide policies and programs to address the issues, if managers want to and need to drive engagement in their own groups and do their own thing, in many organizations you have an HR business partner model and they want to do it themselves, Bob's your uncle. Go for it. Do it yourself, right? And use that bottom-up approaches. But so that, remember, with those things, the bottom-up approach and decentralizing the engagement planning approach across an organization, a couple of pitfalls. And the biggest pitfall you're going to run into is consistency. Not only consistency of the action plans, that's you don't mind as long as the employees are involved and they participate. Do what they want. If that improves engagement, that's what we're looking for. It's going to be consistency in terms of actually performing, actually doing it. So you're going to get some sub-organizations, some departments are going to be gung-ho, they're going to jump on this, they're going to have fun, they're going to do the conversations and the workshops that you need to do, and others aren't. They don't see it as a priority, the manager's not interested in it, doesn't want to do it, and so that's where we have to sort of try to manage some consistency. To do that, you need to be clear. Clear mandate, clear instructions. What do we tell employees? When do we tell them? Give them a template. So do what you want, talk about what you want, as long as you involve your employees, the process remains employee-led. Here's an action planning template. You fill this out if that makes it easier. And you know what? On the WorkTango platform, it makes it really easy. You can just go in and there's your template right there. And it's going to give you guides and references and all. This is where technology really works in our favor. The tools, the training, they need to have that. And I did a number, I was working with a regional government in southwestern Ontario. And we did a number, I think 3 or 4 if memory serves, workshops with managers and HR business partners just to help them take this approach on and institute it organization-wide, give them the tools, give them the template, give them the wherewithal to do this so that they can succeed, right? And then when Rob comes on a little bit after, I'm almost done, to talk about this, you'll see if you use WorkTango's platform, you'll already know that these tools are really, really helpful with this part, and they can be helpful with the corporate-wide approach as well. And finally, you need helpers. You need engagement champions or leaders. They might come from HR, they might not, but they have to be there to provide that management support. We tend to depend a little too much on technology to provide that support, and we can see some of the issues with that. We have to remember that, whoops, I went too many. The technology, as good as it is, it can engage and enable engagement in a number of ways. It helps with that action planning. It provides the template, the tools, and the guidance. It provides, the collaborative opportunity, especially if we're working in multiple remote locations. You can see people's faces now when you have those conversations, which is so important. Use the technology, but remember, the technology should be to encourage and facilitate the connectedness, the conversation, and the collaboration that you need for engagement. Employee engagement, and my last word here, is a human process. So the technology should never, ever be used to substitute that humanization. And I'm seeing that trend. So we have to watch out. Use the technology to humanize the process. Don't use the technology to substitute for the human contact. And this is one of the reasons why I think, and I really appreciate WorkTango's approach, because that's exactly what they're trying to do as well. So on that note, I'll stop there. Rob, there might be questions. I don't know if you want to keep going on your end, or if there are questions at this point.
Yeah.
Be good.
Yeah, so the kind of process today was talk about the two approaches, bottoms up, tops down, and then kind of get into some of the enablers from a technology perspective that I was going to walk through. But there were a couple of questions I did want to address, and one that came in from Mohammed was around the concept of champions right now. And the question was, if we were identifying champions, is it okay to have 50 plus, but only 12 for a task force? Like more kind of ratios or any opinion on that?
The reason I say sort of 12 for a task force is because you want to get a group together that's going to take on a life of its own. They're going to be a team, right? And they're going to, as a team, you need to establish a certain dynamic. And anybody who sat in a group or around one of those big oval tables in a committee and with 20, 25 people, how boring is that? Why is it boring? Because you don't get a word in edgewise. Or you got the same four people talking all the time, and you have the people who are less apt to sort of try to impose their will on others. So you get that very, very slanted dynamic. When people leave the room, you might have disagreement, but nobody knows about it because those people never spoke up. When you keep the group small, you allow that to happen. You allow a full group dynamic to take place. That doesn't mean though 8 to 12 people are going to represent everybody. They've got to go out. One of their tasks is to go out and consult their colleagues, their peers, their managers in terms of what to bring into that group. In terms of leaders or champions, that's really something, you know what, that could be unlimited. That you can have many, many leaders and champions. What the leaders and champions are meant to do is to support the process. So if I'm a public works manager and I really don't know, you know what, I don't know how to get my people together. I need some help doing this. Can you give me some advice on that? Maybe can you help me facilitate it? That's where a leader or champion might come in. Very, very similar to an HR business partner, and sometimes the HR business partner acts as the champion. Right? Okay. So that's in terms of the ratios or the numbers. That's what I'd be looking for.
Okay. A couple quick questions before I dive into my section. But Mary Beth asked earlier when we were talking about kind of who owns this, but in a partnership model with many owners, like you have 200 partners in different types of organizations. How do you get everyone on board to support this and understand their role as opposed to?
Oh my God. Yeah. So I've done a number of accounting firms, law firms where you've got it's a partnership type of organization. And yes, you're herding cats. Absolutely, you're herding cats. Because the partnerships, by their very nature, the partners in themselves like to do things their own way. They come together to coordinate for sure, but employee engagement needs to have the support, at least explicit support, active support of the partnership writ large in a consensus way. So if you've got that support, but beyond, if you don't have that support, and one of the big challenges I've had working with law and accounting firms is you've got 2 or 3 partners that really push this ahead, and then they charge the executive director of HR, go do this. They take a vote or have in the partner meeting is okay, yeah, we were all right with that. But one of the first things that has to happen then in that process is you got to go back to the partnership and explain exactly what it is we need to do and where our support is required, because you need to have their active participation, otherwise it's going to fall flat. So before you get started, start with that. You got to essentially bring those folks on side. How do you bring them on side? By showing them the benefits of high engagement. And you know what, you can get tons and tons of material just off Google, just Googling it in terms of the business case for employee engagement. And the other, the biggest thing in these organizations I find, lawyers, accountants, engineers, is what are their peers doing? So you look at a best practice organization in any community, and more often than not, you're going to see the peer organizations, the opinion leaders, are doing this. So there's your argument. They're doing this. This is one of the reasons why they're succeeding. We need to do this. And so you're going to get not the naysayers, but the ones that are sort of indifferent. Say, okay, yeah, I'll go along with this. And that's all you need to get started.
Okay, great. So I know a couple of questions just popped in. So what I'm going to do is just try to, in the last, with 15 minutes left and 10 minutes, kind of cover, the section I was going to talk about more on the technology side, on how it plays into this whole action planning equation. And then we'll dive in and answer as many questions as we can with the time left over. But what's interesting is that I actually, in the decision to talk about technology on this webinar, I actually looked up technology on Google, and this is the first picture that I saw, and just the image stresses me out, right? A lot can happen. Technology can do a lot of things. But what I wanted to do was just share briefly with everyone, especially in kind of my day-to-day and what I see in terms of a lot of the trends out there, just 5 things that you can think about how leveraging technology when it comes to actioning from a survey perspective. So, and just things you can consider if you go down that road. Some of you might be leveraging technology today, some may not, but we'll go through these 5 relatively quickly. The first thing is to leverage tech for agility. Also, this was the first picture that came up for agility. I just thought, it was nice to put on as well. But when I talk about agility, there's 2 concepts of agility that I really think that technology plays a role in. One is obviously in speed, right? Today, if you're not using technology, it takes way too long to get that data. You get that 100-page PDF from a vendor. 4 months later, it takes you another 2 months to get that into the hands and distribute it out to other leaders in an organization. And by that time, a lot of that data is stale, and it's hard to act on stale data. Or you have to go in and do Excel wizardry to figure things out. So, if you can get the speed of the data, now you can actually start focusing on action in the moment, right? Not waiting for that. And the second part of agility is really around the frequency. And what I mean by that is kind of what I was mentioning at the beginning of the conversation, where we're seeing a huge trend where organizations are getting away from the giant survey once a year, once every 2 years, because they want to start be able to get feedback, act, and start seeing an impact of that more frequently. Again, it's so hard to get people to act in your organization, especially leaders, if there's no check-in or another piece of data showing trends until 365 days later. So what technology allows you to do is when you get that data quickly, it's now you can actually get more frequent in getting that feedback and seeing the impact of a lot of your actions as opposed to waiting another year to see the employee sentiment on that. But every time I do talk about frequency, people, who would do that? It's too painful. But technology allows you to get feedback, and employees will give you feedback more frequently. Right? We're in an era of feedback culture. I talked about there's no such thing as survey fatigue. It's lack of action fatigue. So when if you're trying to wrap your head around what employees want to do this, I work with large organizations that every 2 weeks, every month, they're getting a quick couple of questions to validate a lot of the things that are happening. And that concept of validation, I think, is the most important point I want to make. What technology is also allowing companies to do is not just the speed and the frequency, but it's the questions you're asking and the approach. And the best way I like to explain that is something that we created called the active listening model. Now, you could just measure engagement and measure sentiment of specific engagement drivers and act on them. But the whole idea, what technology allows you to do is not just measure, but get diagnostics. Right? Dig deeper into the feedback that might be worrisome from a survey. Understand the sentiment on change. Right? Roll out these actions and understand how employees are feeling about those. Or, we always ask for open-ended feedback. Maybe there's feedback about what's happening in the organization we're not specifically asking. But technology in that first level of agility helps you do a lot more. So that was the first one. The second is leverage technology to share. And what I mean by that is the trend we're seeing in a lot of organizations is all the people on the screen. Norm said it should be everyone has a role, right? Not only employees, but leaders and managers, executives, HR. But many companies that I get the pleasure of working with are not just keeping the data in HR or waiting, months later to put into the hands of those leaders, but they're actively adding in real time tens, hundreds, thousands of leaders to see what they should see and what they're accountable for. So maybe it is their country or their department or their location or just their direct reports and hierarchy. But when you share that information, now there's a trust level and levels of accountability go up. So kind of using that segue, what the speed and agility does is it breeds the ability to share from a technology perspective, but what that sharing does is it breeds accountability. And that's really the third major component of what I want to talk about. This is also the first picture that comes up when you write accountable, so I thought I'd use that as well into Google. But when I talk about leveraging technology for accountability, there's a couple of key items that organizations are starting to leverage today. Norm, you'd mentioned a couple of them. The first is that unfiltered insight, right? So think about it. If you're giving access to your leaders to their sentiments of their teams on a more frequent basis, they're immediately seeing where things are going up or down, and you're accountable to act when you're starting having measurements on those items. And again, when it's more frequent, again, you're actually going to conduct actions and are accountable to do that. So companies are just giving that data unfiltered to employees, to leaders. And sometimes it's open-ended comments, some not. I know the sensitivities around that, but that's kind of the first part. The second is technology today, is using AI and other methods to actually recommend actions and learnings to those individual leaders. To Norm's point, it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all in a large global organization, or HR to hold everyone's hand individually to hit the drivers that are impacting their team. But technology can actually start recommending and nudging and helping leaders, not just, again, what to do, but where maybe they can upskill themselves in those certain items as well. And the third component is really around assigning, creating, and tracking actions. Some companies have it really buttoned down where they have those workshops, they identify action plans, and they throw them into their current performance management platform or system. But some companies, they're not heavy users of that system, or that system is not very frequent or not set up to do that. So companies are leveraging technology to do just that. Companies can assign tasks to individuals as that action plan. Leaders can create their own, based on the feedback from their team. So in that spirit of technology enabling action, it can really do a lot in terms of building that accountability, recommending, and then really making sure people themselves can be accountable, as opposed to HR searching and finding out from each leader if they've conducted their tasks or not. I do another talk on a concept, and it's called managers or tools. And the idea around this talk is that what type of tool do you want in terms of your manager? Do you want one where, the concept of tool, which is kind of a fool in an organization? Or do you want someone who's going to be able to help you drive engagement in the organization? And the reason why I bring up this concept is that at the end of the day, unfortunately, we put leaders into situations through our HR processes that make them feel like tools, right? Here's your data that's 6 months old. We're going to expect you to do X, Y, Z, and we're not going to have any accountability or tracking of that item. But again, some of the technology allows you, based on the items I've just mentioned, to start leveraging managers as a key tool to help drive engagement in different elements of the business. We know you can't go in and hold every manager's hand and fix it for them, but you can enable them, and technology is a really great way to do that. The fourth thing I want to mention is leveraging technology for context. So when I talk about that, is technology is now doing wonderful things to show you what I call the art of data, right? How do you look at, art is actually an acronym for absolute, relative, and trend. But when you're still start looking at that data, now you can immediately see our different departments, countries, locations, how is engagement sentiment, different between those, right? How can you have a leader see how they are doing comparable to the rest of the organization or a part of the organization? And on that trend side, the ability to see that as well. So that context that goes into not just you have a score of 35% in leadership, you start adding a little more context, which again breeds a lot of the things we were mentioning earlier. So I always like to talk about one of the major trends in technologies. Now you're able to dig deeper, which is way more challenging and took a lot more time before. And the last part of the concept of leveraging technology for context is not just the data and quantitative, but it's the open-ended side as well. And what I mean by that is many organizations, they shy away from asking open-ended feedback because they're worried about, hurting someone's feelings, or it's too much data to go through. But the reality is employee voice works when there's two components, right? There's two types: workplace dissatisfaction, so things you're asking today. What are people's sentiment to specific engagement indexes or drivers, etc. But more importantly, it's not just measuring whether people are happy or not for a specific item. The second part is participative management. And that's the recommendations, the discussions from employees, what they think the organization could do on the open-ended side of things. Technology is now allowing companies, and we do this every day, where you can take tens, hundreds, thousands of comments and start looking at sentiments and themes very, very simply. There's even places where you can interact with those comments and still keep them completely confidential. But the idea on this fourth major trend is that you can leverage technology to add more context in a much easier and simpler way. And the last thing I want to mention before diving into questions is that just don't start with tech. That's kind of the last piece of advice, right? Start with the vision in mind. What does success look like? And then find a tool to be able to make it a reality. And again, I work for HR technology companies. I've done it all my life, and I'm telling you, technology is the enabler, right? You need to have the vision, the support, the advisory to be able to get to the next level. But again, you have to start with what success looks like and then plug in the tech to make it a reality. So that being said, that was what I wanted to end with. Norm gave some really good practical ways you can rally your teams, do top-up, bottoms-down approaches. But what I wanted to do was just really identify, 5 ways to leverage technology to make acting on survey results a lot easier, faster, more efficient, right? So leverage it for agility, leverage it for sharing to other folks in the organization that actually have the biggest impact on engagement, right? The leadership level. For accountability, right? Making sure you're either getting into their hands or tracking that. For context, understanding how that relates to other parts of the organization or the open-ended side. And again, at the end of the day, leverage tech to enable your vision. So I find that's a really good kind of package from how technology plays in this role. So that being said, I said we would leave 5 minutes for questions. There's a couple that came up here. I'm switching mindsets now and looking to see if any came up. But Norm, did you see any come up that you wanted to address on your side?
I'm not getting the same screen, so I'm not the right person to ask.
All right, sounds good. I am going to ask the question, though, that one I saw that I wanted to ask earlier was from Shane, and said, how can a middle-of-the-road HR person who reads and sends out engagement survey help to drive the actions and initiatives of the C-suite? So someone may not have influence at the executive level from an HR perspective.
You know what? Everybody has influence. It's just a question of how you marshal it. So if somebody basically starts with, I've got an idea, and hopefully you're working in a culture that's going to provide a safe environment for those ideas. Not all cultures do that, by the way. Many don't. But essentially, it's very much like the political process. You tell your idea to someone who tells their idea to someone who says, this is a great idea, let's talk to the boss. When the individual who does have influence see that this is a groundswell of support and is going to make them successful, then they're going to push it along. And it's always a question of how do you make the person who supports you, how do you make them look good with that idea? And so that's how I've seen in many organizations, a small idea have gained a groundswell of support. And one of the things, I work a lot with a couple of global organizations, and one of the truisms that I could tell you is the best ideas never come from headquarters. They always come from the field. So when you get ideas, if you're in the center location, if you're at the headquarters, solicit the field. Get the field involved in those conversations. That's where your best ideas are going to come from.
Okay. Another question briefly said, can you do both top and bottom down to see if there's any common trends? Or would you recommend doing both?
No, you should. I think I started basically saying that it's not one or the other, it's both. Of course, in a very small organization, that'll get redundant really quickly. But in most organizations, you're going to have it broken down into a number of departments. And I would encourage both, because you're going to get confluence. You're going to get, and this is the best way to approach it, because you're going to see from a corporate perspective, there's going to be a couple of themes that cut across. And the ones I can think of off the top of my head, career growth usually is one, where if we can put in a job shadowing program, if we can put in cross-training across the board, that's going to help everybody in the organization. But in my department, you know what? I would like to work on work-life balance. So let's get a group together in my area, and we'll talk about work-life balance. And it might influence our area, but not necessarily in others. And so when people are working at those two different levels, they're going to be touching on the things that affect them most. And so when you go across the organization, that's when you're going to see the best impact. So that was a long-winded answer to say both, top down and bottom up.
All right, we're going to try to get a quick one in a minute before time, but what's a typical lifespan of the post-survey or engagement action plan? Curious about the ideal frequency of the planning. I appreciate it if you could shed some light based on your experience.
Okay, so the action planning, well, the best is to strike while the iron's hot. So you're going to get a lot of enthusiasm, you're going to get a lot of momentum. So when the survey results come out, get them out there fast, get some action planning going within a month to 2 months at least. And so what tends to happen then the biggest issue is going to be your momentum. So once that action plan is in place, The key is momentum. So what we have to do is build in those accountability mechanisms to say, oh, well, what have we done recently on this? And that's where tech comes in, really helpful. So the tech, as you were saying, it can provide that accountability mechanism, but you can also do it in another couple of ways. You can get basically peers to say, okay, let's meet in 6 weeks, and this is where the engagement committee comes in. Your peers or the engagement committee, and they say, okay, we need to meet now, we're going to do progress. And of course, you know how this works, right? So a lot of people, they haven't done anything, oh, the meeting's coming up, I better do something. So you spur that on. And what I've done as well is I work with a number of organizations where that's all I do after the action plan is done. I'll check in with them. We do them, 3, 9, 6, 9 month check-ins. Well, I'll just, call up the committee and I say, you guys, how you doing? And just that sense, oh, we got to tell Norm how we're doing. We better do something. So you get that, you get that bump up in momentum, but you got to keep that going. And then finally, when you're getting to, if you're not measuring on a, most organizations are doing sort of a haphazard, so they're not doing the constant listening you're talking about. They're still doing the year-long or even longer than that survey. As you're approaching the next one, this is a great time, about 6 weeks to 2 months before. See that coming and say, okay, now we got to basically tell everybody all the good work we did to improve engagement, because not everything you did is going to touch everybody. So I call that, you've heard the phrase, practice what you preach. I call it preach what you practice, right? So, communicate, tell people that we did this because we heard it on the survey and it had that result. That's huge when people can look at that. Even if the initiative didn't touch them personally, if they see that, oh, they're listening to us, then that in and of itself will boost engagement.
Great. So I'm conflicted. It's 2 minutes past the hour. There's still questions coming in after 2 o'clock. There's still 90 people here. Norm, do you have a couple more minutes to take on?
I got a couple more minutes, yeah. So.
All right. So apologies if we went over, but at least if you have to leave, that's cool. We're going to record it anyways. But one thing that one question that came in said, how do you measure the effectiveness or impact of our engagement action plan?
Easy. Basically, you ask the questions in a subsequent survey. Now, if you've got the platform, you've got the constant listening capability, that's the best thing to do, because then you can actually throw a question or two in saying, how do we do on this? How do we do on that? Did you notice any positive change from our initiatives? And those, I mean, I'm not rhyming off the actual wording of the questions here. I'm talking conceptually, but that's what a survey is best meant to do. Check in. Right? We've done something, so at a certain point in time, you can actually do a very, very crisp couple of questions saying, did you notice this? Did you see that? Did you see that? Mm-hmm. And then you'll get the feedback. And just the act of asking people if they were touched by these things, if they, what their thoughts and improvements or recommended improvements are, that goes a long way to showing that the organization is listening, showing the organization is serious. So yeah, use the technology to do that. Very crisp, very short pulse surveys in terms of, this is what we did, X, Y, Z. Did you notice it? Did it make a difference? Right? And you get a read.
Great. So looking at it's 1 minute past or to 2:05, and there's so many questions, I'm just gonna kind of end it at one last one. So apologies for the folks that we didn't get to. I'm going to see from our team if there's a way to kind of get a hold of those and somehow get back to you. But the question was, our company functions with 80% of staff working hourly. What would your suggestions be in terms of compensation for the work done after the meeting, or if you've seen that experience before?
I've done a lot of work in that area, yes, and it's fair. You need to pay them. So by not doing that, you're sending absolutely the wrong message. You're sending a message that you are not valued. It doesn't cost a lot in those types of organizations. Most people are not earning huge wages anyway. So you're compensating for that effort, then that goes a long way. And you know what? It won't cost you a whole heck of a lot.
Amazing. So I was going to say thank you, but earlier I read a comment, and I'm not sure who wrote it, but it was a good way to sum up my thanks to you, Norm. And it says,
Oh, my pleasure.
it says, unveiled the curtain for me and made this process not as scary to tackle. Thanks so much. Norm's, can't even say the word.
Colloquialisms.
Colloquialisms
Yes.
are amazing. And quote, what I was gumming about, they just start to peter out. Bob's your uncle. You're absolutely hurting cats. So thank you for that comment. So again, I want to thank everyone for your time. Norm, again, thanks
Indeed.
for providing your
My
kind of
pleasure.
years of wisdom. For anyone that's interested, our next one is coming up March 26th. We're getting through navigating challenging conversations that might come as a result of buy-in on action planning or some of the things you're trying to accomplish with Joel Silverstone. And really, thank everyone for your time and for your participation and great questions. And have a good rest of the hopefully not snowy day.
Oh, well, it's snowy here. Eastern Canada, we're getting it. Thank you very much, everybody. It was great.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.